Good morning. It is evening here, and I hope you can hear me well. I just this last few hours got off my flight from Manila, so I might be a bit jet lagged and I might not make a lot of sense, but don't worry, I'm taking some whiskey to keep me awake. Uh, so, um, so let me just begin by saying that I think that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations shares something with significant with the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC. They have lots and lots, in fact, hundreds of meetings, but very little of substance comes from these meetings. And a number of you have probably attended some of these ASEAN committee meetings and are quite frustrated, that, there's a lot of talk, but very little action. So I think the motto of ASEAN is let's talk, but let's really not act on things. And this has been really the guiding spirit of ASEAN over, the last few decades since its founding in 1967. Well, initially, ASEAN, when it was founded, consisted of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and then in Singapore, and then it was joined by Brunei a few years later. And then there was a major expansion in the late 1990s that brought in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. And there is, of course, the prospective membership of Timor-Leste, which is still in process of being considered. Now, people say that ASEAN has made a contribution to regional security in the sense that it has helped prevent armed conflicts from taking place among its members. And I think, if you're talking about minimum standards, this might be said to be, quote unquote, an accomplishment. Yeah, over the last, say, 20 years, for instance, there have been few, probably just one sort of armed conflict which has taken place between ASEAN member countries, and that was armed confrontation that took place over the Prayer Vihar temple between Cambodia and Thailand. So there have been, of course, tensions between countries. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, there was the conflict over claims to Sabah, pitting the Philippines and Malaysia. Back in the 60s, and there was the confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia, so when it comes to reducing the possibilities of armed conflicts, as a minimum standard for judging ASEAN, perhaps, yes, we can maybe concede it has made some contribution to reducing armed conflicts over the last 20 years. Before that, of course, was a different story. So ASEAN evolved with, in the beginning, with two main impulses, a strong one and a weak one. A strong impulse in the very beginning was anti-communism. And, for all intents and purposes, ASEAN in its first 2 decades was a pro-Western organization. And in the late 70s, for instance, and the 1980s, ASEAN took a leading role in opposing Vietnam in the conflicts in the old Indochina Peninsula. And a large part of that was fear of communist expansion. Then there was a weaker impulse, and this was sort of a desire for some neutrality or some non-involvement in the fight among the superpowers. And here we can see this weak impulse towards neutrality when it comes to several very important documents. The ASEAN as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, which was signed in I believe it was in the 1970s, and the ASEAN nuclear weapons-free zone, that declared ASEAN basically as nuclear weapons-free. But I would say that this was a weaker impulse to the stronger anti-communist impulse in the first few decades of ASEAN. When it comes to certain key issues like human rights, I think it is fair to say that ASEAN has had a very poor record. And I think there have been two major blocks to ASEAN taking a more stronger, proactive role when it comes to human rights. One is the consensus process of decision making, where there has to be a consensus on an issue, before ASEAN can even declare something on it, much less act on it. And the second thing is the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of member countries, which has really been a very, very strong block towards ASEAN's taking a really active role when promoting human rights. Okay, and we can see that, and when we look at the case of Myanmar, to just take a more recent development. Now, of course, this does not mean that rhetorically ASEAN has not made statements on human rights. And in fact, ASEAN made a declaration on human rights. I believe this was around, I'm not sure now the date, 2000. But even that declaration of ASEAN was criticized by many as a sort of putting conditions on the respect and implementation of the human rights as articulated by the United Nations. Um, and I think we can see the recent Myanmar situation as a debacle on the part of ASEAN. Yes, ASEAN said, because of pressures coming from different directions, that it would have a policy of engagement in Myanmar. But ever since the coup of February of this year, but in the statements that the ASEAN principal parties, led mainly by Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, have been pushing, there's more of a concern about, hey, we need some regional stability. This is why there must be internal peace in Myanmar. So there was not really a concern for human and democratic rights. And then there was no condemnation of the attacks on ethnic minorities in Myanmar. There was no call for the release of political prisoners. There was even no demand for a guarantee to see Aung San Suu Kyi. And the person who was appointed to be the envoy to Myanmar is a diplomat who has not really been engaged in human rights diplomacy. This is, the second foreign minister of Brunei, deputy, I believe. And as far as I know, up to this point, the junta in Myanmar has not given him permission to see Aung San Suu Kyi. And, the ASEAN principal countries, governments, have not, in fact, pushed this. So you can see that this rhetoric of engagement is really a cover for being as soft as possible. And in this case, as soft as possible to the junta. Instead of treating the junta as a regime that has to be kept at a distance in the ASEAN engagement in Myanmar, it is being seen as a negotiating partner, which means that ASEAN is in fact extending legitimacy to the junta in Myanmar, which is why many people have from the very beginning opposed ASEAN's engagement when it refused to make a condemnation of the illegal character of the regime, knowing that ASEAN would just, go into this process of talk, which even by itself legitimizes the existence of the junta. So far, the ASEAN engagement with Myanmar has really been a process of extending legitimacy to the junta. You can see this, for instance, another aspect of this is the Philippine government, for instance, which I'm more familiar with, has really made no official statement on the military junta, except some soft personal statements from our foreign secretary or foreign minister, about, restoring the status quo, but that was not a formal statement. And the reason for this is very clear. Okay, there's been a deal. Maybe it's not written down, but it is implicit between the junta and the Duterte government, which has been under a lot of attack for human rights violations, for extrajudicial executions. Hey, we'll be silent on what you've done if you'll be silent about our record of thousands of extrajudicial executions. So the Philippines is not, in fact, one of these principal parties engaged with Myanmar, precisely because of this informal deal of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, which means I won't talk about human rights in your country or about democratic rights if you are not going to talk about human rights in my country. Now, aside from Myanmar, the other big issue that has really engaged ASEAN over the last 20 years has been the South China Sea, or what we call West Philippine Sea issue. The countries that are in the very direct confrontation with China around recognition of their rights to the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, the recognition of their exclusive economic zone rights, for instance, that recognition of their territorial rights, and this is the Philippines and Vietnam, have only had soft support from other members of ASEAN when it comes to pushing China to respect ASEAN or the rights of ASEAN member states. And not only have they not had strong support, some ASEAN member countries have not been sympathetic to supporting the rights of ASEAN member states, meaning Vietnam and the Philippines in particular, although Indonesia, Malaysia, are also, important as affected parties in the South China Sea issue. Because of that, ASEAN has been practically paralyzed, practically because of the veto of Cambodia and to some extent Laos on this issue. The last major common statement that ASEAN had made was really the declaration for a code of conduct in the South China Sea that it agreed upon with China. But that was the last. And China has been quite successful in splitting or neutralizing ASEAN member countries by saying that, hey, we don't want to deal with you as a multilateral body, but we'll deal with you on a bilateral basis. So let's do it country to country and not multilaterally. So I think that to some extent, China has been quite successful in splitting the ASEAN when it comes to this, to this issue. Okay, so let me just, make a few more points. One of the important peacemaking mechanisms that emerged from ASEAN that was especially promising in the late 1990s was the ASEAN Regional Forum. And there was a momentum to the ASEAN Regional Forum. And I think part of that momentum was promoted by people like the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Muhammad Mahathir. And the ASEAN was emerging as a sort of diplomatic multilateral organization that would be very much, the arbiter of conflicts in the area, especially superpower conflicts. And the ASEAN Regional Forum, I believe it met yearly, brought together at its core the ASEAN member states, and beyond that, it brought in the United States, it brought in China, et cetera, et cetera. So it was the ASEAN Regional Forum, but at the core of it was the ASEAN member countries. Unfortunately, the ASEAN Regional Forum did not really emerge as a diplomatic mechanism for the resolution of conflicts, although it still meets regularly. Why did it not emerge? There were two reasons for this. One was the Asian financial crisis of 1997, 1998. I think that because the ASEAN countries were very much affected by this, they were the ones at the forefront of the ASEAN Regional Forum, their sort of credibility suffered a lot from their loss of economic status. Because as you know, before the Asian financial crisis, they were seen as the tiger cubs that were really going to make a very, very important efforts at becoming developed countries. But after the Asian financial crisis, they lost that status. And in fact, they haven't really recovered the economic status they had since 1997. The other thing was the United States played an active role in making sure that it would be the axis of military and alliance diplomacy in the region. President Clinton made this very clear back in 1996, where he said, that it is really the United States that, that provides the security for the region. There's no other body.
I'll give you a few more minutes, please.
Sure, yeah. I'm about to finish.
Yeah. All right.
There's no other body that can substitute for the United States as a peacemaker. So those two factors, the Asian financial crisis and the sabotage by the United States of the emergence of the ARF as a diplomatic mechanism for peacemaking, accounted for the failure of the ASEAN Regional Forum after initial successes. So let me just sum up what the main points of what I have said. One is that I have to put this crudely: is ASEAN is all talk and no action, and that's the first thing. The second thing, that I would say is that yes, ASEAN might have contributed to reducing conflicts among its member countries, but that is a very minimum standard, okay? Armed conflicts. Third is that the biggest block to ASEAN has been its two main decision mechanisms, which is only consensus. After consensus, can you embark on a core of action? And secondly, non-interference in the internal affairs of member states, like promoting human rights or criticizing violations of human rights. Finally, there are two areas where we can see ASEAN being very ineffective at this point. And one is the ASEAN engagement with Myanmar, which really has done nothing but legitimize the junta, okay, by this process of engaging it as a negotiating partner, when in fact it should be engaging the Aung San Suu Kyi government, which is the legal government of Myanmar. And the second issue has been ASEAN's ineffectiveness on the attacks, on the encroachments of China, on the rights of its economic rights and territorial rights of its member countries in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, because of division within ASEAN that China has been able to exploit. And finally, let us not forget, that when it comes to trying to provide for a diplomatic mechanism for regional security, ASEAN has faced the opposition of the United States, which until now sees itself as the only force that can provide region-wide security to the Pacific region. So let me just end there, and thank you again for inviting me to participate. I hope I have made sense, and that I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you.